Welcome everybody to this talk on Cardijn's greatest battle at the Second Vatican Council on the theme Lay Apostolate versus Apostolate of the Faithful. I've chosen that theme because I noticed during the Australian Plenary Council that that distinction didn't seem to be very well understood. And of course, lay apostolate was a concept that Cardijn fought for throughout his whole life. And in fact, through the movement that he established, the Young Christian Workers, and also the other specialised Catholic action movements were movements to promote that lay apostolate. I will just mention in brief and as an introduction, a homage to the city of Lille, where I'm speaking from now. There were a number of bishops here who played key roles in the council, all of whom were Joseph's chaplains, including Cardinal Achille Leonard, who was a very close collaborator of Cardijn over a period of 40 years, as was his colleague Palamon Glorieux, the head of the theology faculty here in Lille, and also another Glorieux, Achille Glorieux, who became the secretary of the Lay Apostolate Commission at the council, and also the secretary of the commission that drafted Gaudium and Spes. So Lille, actually, it's not really kind of acknowledged much in the histories of Vatican II, but the people from Lille played a very important role in the council, and I'll speak of some of that as we move along. Yes, as I've mentioned, the Cardijn's key distinction was between lay apostolate and apostolate of the faithful. He distinguished between the apostolate that we all have by virtue of our baptism as Christians and as Catholics, in which we're called to take part in the whole apostolate of the church, including, as he noted, the hierarchical apostolate, but also doctrinal, sacramental, liturgical, looking after the poor, the whole works. However, he insisted that lay people also have a specific and irreplaceable mission, which actually is shared with the whole of humanity. So the lay people's role overlaps with that of people who are even outside the church, non-Christians, non-Catholics, and everything. And it's a mission, as he stated on so many occasions, was a mission for lifting up and developing the world, beginning from our local life situations. Now, I've divided this talk into seven parts, beginning with the rise and fall of the lay apostolate, how that term came into use and then disappeared, what Cardijn meant by the genuinely lay apostolate. Thirdly, its relationship with Catholic action, which is often another cause of conflation. People don't kind of manage to make the distinction between that. Then we move on actually to the actual battles that he took part in, particularly in the preparatory commission, where he wrote 21 papers trying to convince the commission members of the concept of lay apostolate he was promoting and defending. Once the actual council began on 60 years ago today, on the 11th of October, there was a completely new dynamic with 2,500 bishops present, of whom nearly 250 had been formed as YCW chaplains or YCS chaplains or chaplains in one of the other specialised Catholic action movements. Quite a significant minority who played a very significant role. And we'll see what they achieved in looking at the actual documents of the council at the end from the point of view of what Cardijn was trying to achieve. And I'll conclude with literally what was Cardijn's deathbed warning of what he foresaw happening after the council. So the rise and fall of the lay apostolate. Well, there's a very interesting tool produced by Google called the Ngram, which allows you to trace the emergence of words or terms in the literature published since 1800. And you won't probably be able to see it on your screens there, but you can see, if you can take it from me, that at the beginning we start with 1800 and we go right through to today. And you can see that in the 19th century, in English, this is the English language books that Google has scanned and searched. There is virtually no mention of the term lay apostolate. It only starts to come into play from about the beginning of the 20th century. And we see the graph start to rise following the establishment of the YCW, the JOC, and the other specialised Catholic action movements. And it reaches a peak during the Second Vatican Council, after which there's a precipitous decline, which perhaps we can discuss later. And we can see similar thing. I'll mention also, yes, there was a Catholic encyclopedia published in the USA in 1913, and that's also significant. There are only 2 mentions of the term lay apostolate in that. The second one, Philibert Vrau, actually was a very important lay figure here in Lille, and the other was Leon Olly Leprune, who I regard as the philosophical father of the Gigacz Act. We'll come back to a bit of that later as well. But we'll look at what the emergence of the term lay apostolate in other languages as well. And we see in Spanish, it's very similar. Nothing much in the 19th century. The term starts to emerge in the 20th century, follows the same graph going upwards towards the council and peaking. Actually, there's 2 terms that are kind of alternatives in Spanish: secular apostolate and lay apostolates, and you can see how they overlap there. And mostly the most common term is the red one, which actually is the term secular apostolate, which is equivalent to what we call in English lay apostolate. Again, you know, why did it? Well, we can see why the rise happened, or at least my explanation is the growth of our specialized Catholic action movements. And then we can ask the question later, what happened afterwards? And this is very similar in German. I won't go on about it, but you can see that the graph follows the same path. And we'll move to the French, which is what we're going to be mainly concerned about today, because we can actually see the development, which also kind of implies, which I think is true, that actually the term grew in a French environment. And we see, and I'll be explaining just shortly, some of the key figures in the development and emergence of that term. And you can see in French a much more kind of detailed picture of how the term went up and down over those years, including the decline after Vatican II. So what did Cardijn mean? What was that? What did he mean by lay apostolate that he worked his whole life to promote and defend? Well, actually, we'll start with some general kind of background of what was the 19th century about. Well, of course, from a Cardijn YCW background, we know, of course, the importance of the Industrial Revolution. And of course, what that meant was the growth of cities, which meant concentrations of people. And in parallel with that, we see in the USA and Europe and other countries as well, there was an emergence of the concept of the people and the rise of democracy and democratic revolutions. And in the church, that was paralleled by kind of revived awareness of the people of God. It's there in the Bible, it's been there for 2,000 years, but as this awareness among the community emerged of the people, this also emerged within the Catholic community as well. So we see that emerging in the 19th century. Now, what are the words that are used in the church for people? Well, the word demos, which is the Greek term from where the word democracy comes, is not much used in Catholic circles. Often we've said, well, the church is a hierarchical body. It's definitely not a democratic institution. The term in Christian teaching or thought over nearly 2,000 years is another Greek word, which also means people, laicos, which means particularly laicos with as opposed, that's probably not right, the right word to say, as distinguished from the clergy. So there was a new awareness emerging among the Catholic communities in the 19th century. Also, they tried to look back on, well, what does this mean? The term lay people, the term laicos, which parallel that. And we see this particularly with a man known to all of us, Frederick Ozanam. We've known him as the founder of the Society of St. Vincent de Paul, but perhaps less known is the fact that he was one of the first to articulate what we now call the apostolate of lay people in the world. And it's kind of interesting, in a letter to his brother, it's the first written references that I've been able to find, which is also from another researcher, was he was writing to his brother, Alphonse, who was a priest. And he seems to be saying, well, Alphonse has got a role as a Catholic priest. What's my role as a Catholic layperson? And the outcome of that was he'd been teaching in a Catholic college. He decided to go and get a job in the secular Sorbonne University, University of Paris, where he sought to teach and as a historian to show what Christianity had contributed to the development of France, Europe, the world. Now, it's very interesting from an Australian point of view, at least a Melbourne point of view. This was very much a theme that was adopted by Archbishop Daniel Mannix. And it was the reason why for many, probably more than a century, nobody tried to start a Catholic university in Australia. Influenced by Ozanam, they felt the role of Catholics was to go and get involved in the secular university, the University of Melbourne, Sydney, and all the rest. That was the thinking. Catholics enter into the world and, well, they didn't possibly use that word that Cardijn used, act as the leaven, but very close to that idea. And just on the, also to show that it wasn't only within the church that Ozanam was concerned about things. When the 1848 revolutions broke out in France and across Europe, he was also one of the key promoters, at least in the Catholic community, of the concept of democracy. In fact, he identified democracy with the gospel. So this is where the ideas come, and Ozanam was one of a very key influence on Cardijn. And Ozanam, he died young, only 40 years old roughly, but his ideas were taken up by others. I've mentioned Leon Ollie Leprun. He was actually known during his lifetime as the new Ozanam because he actually specifically modelled his life on Ozanam, and he had that concept himself of the lay apostolate. And it's very, very significant that he was the first person to articulate what has been taken up as the method of the YCW and other movements. Ollie Leprun used to say, we've got to learn to see clearly, to judge well, and to decide. Decide meaning to do something, to take action. So it was a very important background there of where the ideas came from. Ollie Leprun's ideas were taken up by a kind of a youth movement called in English the Furrow, which took up his idea of promoting democratic education, teaching people to learn how to act as citizens in their daily lives. And they were probably the first movement to articulate a concept of lay apostolate as a movement. And one of their chaplains, he was actually a lay brother, but he was kind of trying to provide a theological foundation for what their work. And he explained that the Sion movement, as it's known in French, was lay by its action and operated on the side of civil society. And he also stated that lay people, they had a kind of very, I don't say the word, had an indispensable role in the church. And it was a duty actually that was a natural duty, not necessarily imposed by church, but in fact imposed by the fact that they were citizens of the world. Now this caused already a very big backlash, and the short story is that in 1910, Pope Pius X cracked down on them and asked them the leaders to resign and to submit themselves to the bishops. And that sadly was the end of the Sion, a tragic but also prophetic story, which was picked up by Cardijn very shortly afterwards when he began his work in Belgium. And I won't tell you the story. I think many of you know the story of the foundation of the YCW, but it's very interesting to see by the 1930s, when Cardijn was also trying to articulate the theological foundation of what the YCW was trying to do. He does that in terms of the lay apostolate. The lay apostolate is proper to lay people. It's lay people acting in their own lay milieu, their environments, transforming their own life, their family life, and also transforming the world on a larger scale, social and political. And he saw that as different. And also, this is quite significant, I think, not derivative from the priestly apostolate. So you'll all remember probably that the famous Catholic Action definition of Pius XI, lay people participating in the apostolate of the hierarchy. That's definitely not how Cardijn saw the lay apostolate. Lay apostolate is more in the sense of Ozanam and Ollie Leprun and the Sion, lay people acting under their own initiative in the world. And he articulated that in so many different ways, including those famous phrases he had. Without work, there'd be no host, no wine, no pattern, nor even religion. He turns the whole church on its head, really. Instead of lay people being dependent on lay people, the church is dependent on, instead of lay people being dependent on the church, it's actually the church and priests which are dependent on lay people. So it's a completely kind of almost, well, it is a revolution in a way of looking at the church. And this is the concept that he defended and promoted through the movement, That's what the YCW was aiming to form people through the movement. Now, of course, that raises the question, how does he achieve this? And again, I can't spend time on this, but many of you from the YCW will be familiar with Cardijn's 3 truths. This is how he explained his method. It was kind of his answer. He said it himself, it was his answer to the Marxist dialectic. He saw a contradiction between what our faith teaches and what we experience in the world, and particularly speaking about young workers, as he did so many times, the terrible experiences they had in their workplaces, in the community and all that. And there was a need to do something as a Christian and as a Catholic to change that situation, which was what the See, Judge and Act formed people to do. So that is a method, that was the method for forming people to carry out their lay apostolate in their lives and in the world. That's all kind of background. But we see how that idea spread not only through the specialized Catholic action movements, but also on a more broader level as well. In fact, to a certain, you could also argue that, in fact, we can see in the 1950s that the concept of lay apostolate starts to take over from Catholic action. There were 2 world congresses in the 1950s, 1951 and 1957. And it's very, very significant. They weren't world congresses on Catholic action. They were world congresses on lay apostolate. And that was very greatly due to Cardijn's lobbying and the lobbying of the movements that wanted that to happen in that way, rather than to have world congresses on Catholic action. Cardijn was actually the keynote speaker at the first one, and he gave a very famous speech, which is echoed through to today. In fact, if you read it, which you can later, you'll see that it very closely foreshadows Gaudium and Spes, starting with the situation of the world, all the different things happening in the world, the developing countries, poverty, peace, all the various issues that were later taken up by Gaudium and Spes only approximately less than 15 years later. So for that was the field of the lay apostolate, and that's what he explained to the people at that First World Congress, and the idea was followed again in 1957. So this brings us up to just before the start of Vatican II. But before I head into the itself, I mentioned that it's important to distinguish between Catholic action and lay apostolate, and to understand how Cardijn saw the relationship between the two. So I mentioned just a minute ago how the famous definition of Pius XI was the participation of the laity in the apostolate of the hierarchy. And that was changed by the next popes. They re-articulated in different ways. Pius XII spoke of collaboration, and John the 23rd spoke of cooperation. But the basic idea remained, which was lay people helping out the hierarchy. That was the idea. So again, we can see that's very, very different from what we've just spoken about as the Cardijn's concept of the apostolate of the laity. So then what's the relationship between the two? Well, Cardijn explained it very, very quickly, very simply. It was a Catholic action was a representative body officially mandated by the church to promote the lay apostolate. So that was a relationship. It didn't replace the lay apostolate, it promoted the lay apostolate. So it was an official institution of the church to promote that concept of the lay apostolate, which he articulated and which I've just endeavored to explain. He saw it as a school of service, representation and education for people to learn how to carry out their lay apostolate in their lives and in the world. So this thing is very important to keep in our minds, because as I say, often people conflate the two, and it's also why people forget about and overlook the importance of the lay apostolates, because they think, well, Catholic action, participation in the hierarchy, that was pre-Vatican II. And because they conflate it all, they overlooked what Cardijn was saying and what the council says about the lay apostolate. So that's just a little bit of a interlude there. To summarize, yes, well, actually I've kind of already summarized it. The role of the apostle of the hierarchy, again, is to promote the apostle of the laity, to promote their participation and collaboration. And his big struggle, one of his early struggles, was to actually have the YCW identified and recognized as an authentic form of Catholic action, which in fact Pope Pius XI did do in 1935. And this brings us right up to the start of the council, which, as we know, was called by Pope John the 23rd in the beginning of 1959. And of course, such a big event takes quite a number of years to prepare. And Cardijn didn't hold back from the beginning, even if he didn't actually specifically articulate it. He went to see Pope John the 23rd about 3 months after he called the council. Soon after, he proposed to John the 23rd that there should be an encyclical to commemorate Rerum Novarum, which actually, as we also know, was became the encyclical which endorsed the Gigacz method. Very, very significant, because this is before the council started to meet. The Gigacz method had already been made a formal part of Catholic social teaching. Also important, and also myself, I kind of have overlooked it until I was preparing this talk. I see also that the Mater Magistra has something quite important to say about the lay apostolate. In fact, it also has more to say about lay apostolate than Catholic action. So you see there's a move there, even in Catholic social teaching, papal teaching, there's a move from Catholic action to putting lay apostolate in the forefront. And this is very important, because this was a document that was being read not only by the drafters of the conciliar documents, but also by the bishops. And it meant that already a big battle had been won before the council had even started to meet. However, as I'm saying, it was not Cardijn's only battle. His big battle was in the Preparatory Commission on Lay Apostolate. Now, actually, the creation of a Lay Apostolate Commission was a very big move in itself. It was not proposed by the Curia, the Roman Curia. It was proposed by John the 23rd himself. He made a personal decision. He added that commission to the other proposed preparatory commissions, and he called it the newest mark of the council. So it shows you the concern that John the 23rd had for that, and it was going to be entrusted with all these issues relating to laity and religious and social Catholic action. In fact, he doesn't even mention Catholic action. He talks about social Catholic action. So again, he's making that distinction. And we see he appointed a Josephist priest, Monsignor Achille Glorieux, as secretary of that commission. Even the president of that commission was known to Cardijn, because he'd been nuncio in Brussels for a long time. And there were quite a number of Josephist bishops who had previously been YCW chaplains who were appointed as members of that commission. However, like the way these commissions work is they have meetings and then they have drafters. And the drafters, the ones who were actually drafting the documents, were all people who were working in the Roman Curia, who had no experience of the YCW or any of its other peers. And what that means in practice is they had little understanding of what Cardijn and others were trying to put forward in the Preparatory Commission. That was the first problems. The second problem was, actually it started quite well, actually, the questions they had, the questions that commission was given, the scope and the limits of the lay apostolate. So that was good. And that sounded quite promising when that commission was starting to work. However, but that was in July 1960. By the time the commission was ready to first meet, the Roman Curia had already proposed 3 subcommissions. And if you look at those 3 subcommissions that were proposed, and look at the titles there, it was notions about relating to all Catholic associations and Catholic action. That was the first subcommission to which Cardijn was appointed. The second one was about social action, and the third one was about charitable action. So the big question is where does lay apostolate fit into this framework? And actually, the short story is that it doesn't. And this has become where Cardijn's battle, not only his personal battle, but the battle of his colleagues who had experience of the lay apostolate movements came. And if you look at those headings, you can see they don't start with the lay apostolate of the person, of the lay person. They all start with what the church is doing. So it's a completely different framework from which they were working. And this becomes the problem, because this framework was fixed from the beginning, and for whatever reason, it didn't change. So Cardijn from the start is struggling where and how to get his idea of lay apostolate into the council. And this is where he starts his series, as I mentioned, 21 notes that he wrote during the preparatory period, almost a note every month. Some of them more developed than others. This one, like for example, note 1, which is actually divided into 5 chapters and sets out, in fact, it's a remarkable document. I recommend it for reading for everybody, in which he explains the concept, starting with the problems of the life of the people. Here we there again, we see the See, Judge and Act, and the apostolic importance of addressing those problems, the formation necessary, the role of the church in relation to that, the need, and in particular Catholic action, and also the recognition by the bishops. And also he mentions, because obviously this is not the only thing in the church, there's also pious, charitable and other social actions and how they fit into the whole picture. And he finishes with the critical point for Cardijn, how priests and also religious men and women are formed as formators, as people who would work with chaplains, whatever the term is, mentors for lay people in their movements. So it's kind of a manual for the council that he prepared already. Within 3 weeks, he's nominated into one of those 3 subcommissions, and he sees the difficulty of working within it. So he kind of writes his own manual, the way he thinks the whole thing should go. And actually, we can see over the following months, he riffs on those themes in one document after the other. And in fact, by the number of documents that we see that he's written, we can see the difficulty that he's had to get his ideas across to the people that are actually drafting the documents, because they can't get away from their church-driven view. Their focus is on the kind of what Cardijn regards as what he probably could call the specifically religious apostolate. And he sees that this emphasis and this lack of recognition of the lay apostolate means that it's in effect overlooked or underplayed. But he's not saying that these 2 things are separate. On the contrary, he emphasizes that these 2 things need to be combined, not separated. It's an integral concept. We know now that there's a pontifical dicastery for integral human development. And this is the concept that Cardijn was trying to get across. Not separating the religious dimension from the life dimension, but finding a way to combine the 2. And as I say, he does this in very many various ways, not only riffing on the same things, but also riffing on his own 3 truths, which come back, if you look at the documents, the structure of the documents that he writes, many of them are structured as kind of with that structure of the 3 truths, what the church teaches or what the church believes, what's happening in the world, and therefore, what do we need to do and how do we do it? Emphasis coming back to his method of the See, Judge and Act. And again, you can see his frustrating emerging over time. Like for example, this one here. He recognised, sure, lay people have an apostolate of prayer and suffering and sacrifice, which they share with everybody. But that's not the lay apostolate. This is what he tells them after 6 months of struggle to get this idea across. And it's actually, we can see in the documents where he actually starts to articulate that there's 2 things, because he hadn't actually specifically articulated it earlier. On the one hand is his concept of the apostle of the laity, and on the other hand is this apostolate that belongs to everybody, whether you're a baptized Christian or a priest or a pope. So he's distinguishing the 2 between the apostolate of the laity and the apostolate belongs to all Christians by their baptism, by our baptism. And the failure to make this distinction also leads to, as I've mentioned, leads to a conflation of religious and temporal tasks, again, leading to a failure to highlight the apostolate of lay people. And because of the structure that they were working under, he's forced to actually propose a new chapter. Couldn't we add another chapter on the role of lay people? Well, we can see through all these notes, he's repeating the same thing many, many times. Struggling to get these ideas across in different ways, sometimes even adopting a philosophical approach, distinguishing between the materially and formally lay apostolate, because people just can't get what he's trying to say. The outcome is that by the end of the 2 years of meetings, the draft constitution, which actually is very significant, they actually proposed a draft constitution on lay apostolate, but it was very lacking from Cardijn's point of view, because many ideas were mixed up, and it didn't specifically emphasise and make that specifically lay apostolate. Nevertheless, it's significant, despite Cardijn's critique of it. Later, people regard it as one of the best, if not the best, of the pre-conciliar commissions, precisely because of his work and the work of others who had improved it from what it would otherwise have been. But the fact of the matter is by the end of the preparatory commission, Cardijn had articulated his ideas. He'd spoken about them to many people, but he hadn't achieved his ideas in terms of that draft constitution that was prepared prior to the opening of the council. So what happens when the actual council starts 60 years ago today, on the 11th of October 1962? Well, of course, it was a formal day that day. Bishops processing into the church, a solemn high mass with Pope John the 23rd and the speech and everything. The actual council kind of meetings start the next day. And it's very significant. I've mentioned Cardinal Leonard. The Roman Curia, with all these draft documents, they kind of expected that the 2,500 gathered bishops would pretty much endorse all those documents. Now, of course, there were people like Cardijn and others who were very dissatisfied with all those documents. But what were they going to do? Even the Roman Curia had proposed the election of the new conciliar commissions right from the first day. No time for the bishops to get to know each other or to kind of see who they thought should become the bishops. Well, this is where Cardinal Leonard stood up on his own without being given leave by the president. He got up and called for a break, which would allow the bishops to have time to get to know each other, and therefore to be able to appoint their own bishops to the various new conciliar commissions that were about to be appointed. And it was really a decisive event, because it totally took the control of the council out of the hands of the Roman Curia and put it in the hands of the bishops. And as we see, if you read the history of the first session of the Second Vatican Council, you see how the bishops took hold of different things. Helder Camara, when Cardijn finally arrived there, he wasn't obviously a bishop. When Cardijn finally arrived on the 18th of November, Helder Camara was so happy that he told Cardijn that Josephsism dominates the council, because there were so many Joseph's formed bishops there, several of whom had made very important, even historical interventions, such as the famous one by Bishop de Smet, condemning the triumphalism and clericalism and legalism of the church. So things have very much changed. However, not all the battles had been won. Even though there was a new commission for the council, which was replacing the preparatory commission on lay apostolate, there was a new commission, and that's not called the lay apostolate commission. It's called, weirdly enough, the Apostolate of the Faithful Press and Public Spectacles Commission. So they combined all these different things, and they clearly rejected the term lay apostolate commission, and they replaced it with this term Apostolate of the Faithful. So obviously this is going to cause consternation among those who have defended the concept of lay apostolate. And it's very significant that when the first members of these commissions were appointed, Cardijn was not among them. So the question is what happened? What happened? Why wasn't Cardijn Apparatus? Why was the name changed? Well, that's another thesis for somebody to go and scrape through all those Vatican documents and actually find out. However, I do have some hypotheses as to what happened, and you can see it by what Cardijn said. There was opposition from those in the Roman Curia for reasons that I've mentioned. There was also, I'm convinced, but I haven't got formal proof of it, there was opposition from Cardijn's own bishop, Cardinal Sunens, who was totally opposed to the concept of lay apostolate and defended the concept of the apostolate of the faithful. So between the two of them, somehow the name was changed. Obviously, however, that was one thing that happened, but there was other good things that happened by the side of it. The positive things were that there were 3 commissions that took up the work of that previous draft constitution. In fact, this was another negative thing that happened. They had broken the draft constitution. They'd split it into different. They'd put different parts of it into the work of different commissions. Part of it they gave to the Theological Commission, which would work on what became Lumen Gentium. Part of it was what they were calling the Commission on the Faithful, which would lead to Apostolicam Actuositatem. And then part of it also was later given to the Joint Commission, which would draft what became Gaudium and Spes. The good news was that there were many Joseph bishops on these three commissions, and in particular on that Joint Commission that would draft Gaudium and Spes, which is quite clearly dominated by bishops who all had Joseph's formation. And so this is all part of the reaction to what was happening. For example, Camara wrote to Sunans, calling on him to support Cardijn. He also requested John the 23rd to make Cardijn an archbishop and cardinal, which kind of shows you how Camara was wanting to put Cardijn on an equal footing with his own bishop, who he knew was opposed to what Cardijn was doing. And so there was a reaction by these bishops to what had happened. And by March 63, Cardijn was in fact appointed as apparatus to that new commission, which they didn't get around to changing it. I guess they made a strategic decision or a tactical decision not worth the fight over changing the name. And it was formally still known as the Commission on the Faithful, but informally it was always referred to as the Lay Apostolate Commission. And as I said, this opposition continued for Cardijn from his own bishop. He had written a book for the council, which we know in English as Laymen into Action, or a later edition, Lay People into Action, which defended his conception of lay apostolate. Sunans wanted changes to the book. He wanted Cardijn to kind of basically tone down his concept of lay apostolate. And this caused Cardijn literally a spiritual crisis between obeying his bishop, as all priests must do, and staying faithful to his conscience and to everything he'd worked for through his life. In the end, he appealed to Sunans, and they kind of reached a compromise in which he took out a few words, but basically the short story is that Sunans backed down and the book was published. Nevertheless, Sunans continued the battle. Many things to tell you about that all day. I really haven't got time to tell you all of those things. But the thing that happened was, with those 250 bishops that were Joseph's bishops, the word was starting to get out of this opposition. And slowly those bishops, those Joseph's bishops, started to get organised. And this tide really particularly started to turn with the election of Paul VI. Again, Camara wrote to Paul VI asking Cardijn to be made a cardinal, which later he was. And short story is that Paul VI down the line backed, you could say, the Cardijn line, supported the bishops who were in that line as well. And you can see that specifically in the draft document on the church in the world, which was dominated by Joseph's bishops. They chose to follow a See Judge Act format in the drafting of that document. And as I've mentioned, they dominated the drafting, or they had a very significant influence in the drafting of those various documents: Lumen Gentium, Gaudium and Spes, and Apostolicam Actuositatem. So, as I've said, the dynamic changed. But, you know, like also by now, although Cardijn was emeritus, he was now over 80. And he was visibly slowing down. You can see his writing had started to become shaky. He'd resigned, or finally his resignation as chaplain of the IYCW had been accepted, and the others were clearly taking over. He faced one last battle, actually as a member of the Lay Apostolate Commission, or that commission. It was over the name of the decree. It was a big battle right until October 1965 as to whether it would actually be called the Decree on the Lay Apostolate. And he won that battle, again, he and his colleagues. And if you notice now, if you look at it, Apostolic Actuositatem, it's not the Decree on the Laity, it's a Decree on Lay Apostolate, even though, even myself, sometimes you kind of get into the habit of saying the Decree on the Laity. But it's important, at least for us, to realise it was a battle. It was a choice to call it a Decree on Lay Apostolate, not a Decree on the Laity. Now, you know, Cardijn's role in the last session, he was a council father, yes, I mean, they were very significant speeches, actually, but by and large, by this time, the work had been done. The work was being carried by those 250 Joseph bishops at the council. And I'll only just mention his speech, one of his 5 speeches on lay apostolate, which again focused on the need for formation for lay apostles. His lifelong work in a paragraph there, the need to form lay people to understand and to know and live out their lay apostolate. That was his last message to the council in late 1965, the 4th session. So we can kind of see, well, then we've got to look now, well, what did he achieve? What did he and the Joseph bishops achieve? Well, actually, if you look at them individually, it's kind of hard to see. So I think it's very important to look back to that original idea of a constitution on lay apostolate and put back together the ideas that were there. Often when we read Lumen Gentium, it's a very big trend now, we never get past chapter 2, the people of God, which is also why we forget about the lay apostolate. But if you look at chapter 4, it was the principal drafter of it was a YCS chaplain, Gerard Phillips. He was principal drafter of the whole document. Gaudium and Spes, the principal drafter of that, was a YCW chaplain and also a Christian Worker Action chaplain called Pierre Holtmann. Then we see how also Apostolicam Actiositatem also adopts the Sea Judge Act. So you can see in the 3 documents, if you put them together, it's what I regard as a formidable endorsement of everything that Cardijn and his colleagues had fought for over the course of the council. And again, we could spend a lot of time on it, but particularly we look at number 31 of Lumen Gentium. What specifically characterizes the laity is their secular nature, the sanctification of the world from within as 11. What more Cardijn statement could you get than that? Acting within the world as 11, not significantly in opposition to the world, not opposing everything else, not Catholics versus everybody else, Catholics versus the world, but acting within as 11. Cardijn's whole life summarized in that paragraph, in a sense, or Cardijn's whole idea. And recognizing that the lay apostolate is a participation in the salvific mission of the church. So really a very clear endorsement in Lumen Gentium of the concept of lay apostolate. And similarly in Gaudium and Spes, even though its main focus, of course, is that what's happening in the world and what response. It's very significant to note, for example, part 2 of the document is 5 chapters. Every chapter, if you look at it, every single chapter is a see, judge and act. Everyone who's drafted that way as a see, judge and act. But they also recognise in number 43, again, it's a reaffirmation of what's been said in Lumen Gentium, the secular duties that belong properly, but not exclusively to lay people acting. This is the Sion idea of 100 years ago, which got them into so much trouble, acting as citizens in the world. Fantastic, really. And then we come to Apostolicam Actiositatem itself, the decree on lay apostolate. Again, it reaffirms everything we've just said, the vocation of the laity to the apostolate, and includes a chapter in which Cardijn made a particularly important contribution on formation for the lay apostolate. So again, his whole life's work in that chapter, again, recognizing the need to view, judge, and do. Well, actually, that's an English translation, probably by a translator who didn't really get the significance of what the Latin words were trying to say. But we see very clear endorsement of the Cardijn method of formation for lay apostolates. So, it's a total endorsement of everything. So this brings us back to the final thing that I started with. Well, if all that was endorsed so much by the council, what happened after the council? Why did suddenly the concept of lay apostolate reach a peak in the 1960s during the council? Why did it almost suddenly plunge after the council and almost disappear? Well, we can discuss this if you'd like to, but it's very significant. Cardijn foresaw this. Excuse me. He literally gave a deathbed message to some of his colleagues, warning about what would happen. He said, very powerful forces will try to block the recognition of everything that we've achieved, that all those people had achieved. Understand that opposition, this is Cardijn's own words, understand that opposition will not lack to demolish the YCW. Incredible. That's what he said. It was so strong what he said that it was never published. I got hold of it, or sorry, I didn't get hold of it. I was given it by Joe Weber, former international YCW worker, who was there with Cardijn at the deathbed meeting in 1967. Joe was asked not to publish that statement. As soon as he got back from meeting Cardijn, he got his paper out and wrote it down as best as he could verbatim. And 50 years later, when I'm doing my PhD thesis, he brings it to me and tells me he wanted to get the message out, but it's so significant, Cardijn saw what was going to happen. And to battle that, he saw, well, he's not going to be there. You're going to need lay people to do that. It's up to lay people now to take on that battle. You're going to have to develop alliances within the worker milieu, both young and old. He gave us a strategy for what we need to do. It's really kind of quite incredible on his deathbed. That's what he was advising us to do. And we see also, it wasn't only Cardijn saying this, it was recognised by others of his colleagues who said it very kind of politely. Margaret Fever and Jacques Miert refer to the same problem in their biography of Cardijn. More than ever convinced, he made it his duty to react against the tendency, particularly marked since the Second World War, to try to limit the lay apostolate to exclusively religious witness. Now, they don't say the name Soonans there, but that is who they're talking about, because Soonans, as we've seen, was opposing Cardijn's concept during Cardijn's life, and of course he continued afterwards. So, it was the battle was to limit the lay apostolate to what Cardijn called the apostolate of the faithful. Isn't that still happening today? Isn't that what was happening at the Australian Plenary Council? Isn't that what the Australian Plenary Council documents are mostly on about? We as ACI, we tried to get a few paragraphs in. We did achieve to get a couple of sentences in. But if you read those documents, to me anyway, you can see that Battle of Cardijn, the Battle of Cardijn fought during Vatican II, is the battle we've still got today. Thank you very much. Yeah, well, there you go. I talked for a while. Hope you didn't get too tired of all that, but that was really Cardijn's big battle at Vatican II, and I thought it's kind of important to tell people what the battle was and try and see what that means for us today. Okay, thanks very much. Over to you guys now. Say what you like. Jump in when you wish. Questions, comments?
Yes, thanks, Stefan. Perhaps you could chart the course of the conversation for a little while. You got the chats there? Can you see the chat?
Okay, I'll look for the chat. Yeah, I'll open the chat. I don't have. Why is there nothing in my chat? Did some people put something in the chat, did they? I don't know. Anyway, it's probably because I had to cancel the meeting and start again, but it's not there. But anyway, yeah, whatever. Maybe you've got no questions. Maybe I've tired you all out. I probably have. But that was the big battle. That was the battle at the council. As I see it, that's the battle our movements face today. If you ask me why the YCW has a hard time in the church today and the YCS, it's because the church today in Australia and I would say in other countries no longer understands what our movements are trying to do. Nora, I see Nora's got her hand up.
Yes. I just want to say that when I was in the international movement of apostolate of children, it was emphasized that the book of Acts didn't finish when the book of Acts was written all those 2,000 years ago, that the book of Acts actually continues. Because at the time of the book of Acts, did they have a hierarchy? No. They met in each other's homes. They did go to the temple and so on, and they carried on with their relationship with the scribes and the Pharisees. But basically, they were forming a different kind of community. And it was a community of laity in those days. And lay women, played a very critical role in supporting that kind of outreach in society, which was to the poor, the slaves, those who were excluded because of whatever ethnicity or religion and so on. So I think it's also a question of what kind of theology is actually being promoted in the church, and whether they go back to the contextual theology of the New Testament times in which laity rose. The laity rose in terms of the community of the apostles of Jesus. And why did Jesus have that small band of apostles? It was to reach out to very concrete social and political problems within Palestine, where, you know, there was also, and religious problems, might I say, of judgmentalism and, you know, the sticking to the law by very good people who wanted to be whitened sepulchres, but didn't understand why that would be criticized and so on. Anyway, I've said enough here now. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Nora. Yeah, that's great. That's very important. That brings me to another point, which also was important for Cardijn. Yes, for him, the default was when people are baptized, they are baptized as lay people. So they don't lose you don't lose your lay identity by being baptized. You're affirmed in your lay identity, which is, well, that's what I get from what you say about Acts. The church began with lay people. Yep. Back see Judge Acts, let's say. Yep.
Hi, Peter Maher here. Just a comment on or a question really about what's a thought about what's taken over, which is this thing called the new evangelization. I think Sydney Diocese spent a small fortune recently on a conference in Sydney, the main speakers being Julian Porteous, Fisher and a few others. And the emphasis was on how lay people need to go out and bring people back to church, go around to their local streets and invite the neighbours to come back to Mass, as if that was the key role of lay people in the work of evangelization. But I think the question or the comment that your talk raises for me, Stefan, is this huge emphasis we have now, and I mean even the way the Vatican dicasteries are now being organised puts this emphasis on this thing called evangelization or the new evangelization, and I'm wondering if that's, you know, becoming a tool to reinforce that point you made in the last slide. Or have you got any comments on how the new evangelization or this emphasis on evangelization in the current language of the church may or may not be supported or helped along to promote the Cardijn view?
Yeah, well, that's a very interesting question. Actually, you know, one of the documents I found from Cardijn was one of his trips after he'd been to one of his first trips to South America and to Africa. And he came back and he wrote about what he called the bankruptcy of evangelization. That's what he wrote about, what he'd seen the church was doing in those places, those continents. He saw it as bankruptcy of, you know, the existing concept of evangelization. Now, I can't draw a direct line from that to the concept of the new evangelization, but where did the term new evangelization come from? Well, actually, it was first articulated at Medellin in Latin America by the Latin American bishops in 1968. And if you look at the 16 documents of the Medellin bishops' meeting, every single one of them was a See Judge Act. So actually, if you kind of adopt a hermeneutic there, if you look at what Medellin was on about, how Medellin understood the new evangelization, it was how Vatican II understood the new evangelization, which was, from this point of view, as Cardijn understood it, you know. It's kind of, to me, it's a total distortion of the original meaning. Of course, we can, you know, as Alice in Wonderland said, or the Cheshire Cat, we can make words mean whatever we want them to mean. But it's very clear, if you look at Medellin in 1968, it's very clear the original meaning of new evangelization was very much linked to the YCW approach. There's no doubt about that. But it's another part of our history which we've kind of lost, which we need to reclaim. That'd be my answer.
Stefan,
Thank you.
Bill,
Bill
yeah.
Arms. Thanks for that. What it made me think about was it's really important to understand what you were saying and the history for someone like myself, who in my lifetime around the church, or not around the church, one way or the other, I've watched while the church has walked away from all those things that I've been involved in my lifetime. YCS, YCW, Christian Family Movement, the adult movements, the Federation of Adult Movements in Australia, Action for World Development, Catholic Commission for Justice and Peace. The church has always in some way given early support and then walked away from all those. And while there is the religious and theological issues, the underlying thing for me is just the exercise of power by a lot of men. You can't, it seems to me, you can't get away from that, because it's a power struggle. It's a power struggle that's gone on. And having been in 57 at the conference, International Conference in 57, where, you know, we got all excited about the possibility of, and then Vatican II, where we felt great about that, because it sounded like we were getting somewhere. And from then on, it's been downhill all the way.
That's right. I haven't obviously lived all of that kind of voyage, but yeah, the part I've lived is kind of follow that pathway. I mean, you know, I can just, I mean, yeah, the struggle we had in the YCW in my time and in the future and all that. I will say one thing on it, you know, if you look at what the church is trying to do today, among other things, is instead of empowering lay people to act in the world as the leaven, the kind of church seems to think it's going to kind of save the world by having Catholic health and Catholic education and Catholic social services. You know, it's kind of building an alternative world. You know, that's what I mean, it doesn't say that obviously, but if you look at kind of the thinking behind it, that to me, that's the thinking. It's you know, and so, and I would even say, you know, I mean, why does that happen? Well, a short answer is because that's where the money is. You know, the government funds Catholic education, the government funds Catholic health, the government funds social services. And so that's where the church puts its money, and that's where the church goes. And, you know, even in my time for the YCW, we didn't get much money, you know. And I think today there's only one diocese in the whole of Australia where the church actually offers any financial support to the YCW, being Parramatta. You know, how can you run a school? We say the YCW is a school. Cardijn said the YCW is a school. How can you run a school? I mean, and the students have to do everything themselves, including financing the thing, including providing the buildings, including training. I mean, it's just completely nuts. You know, even democratic forms of education, you know, Montessori education, doesn't work like that. You know, they're putting the YCW together as a school and saying, well, okay, go and do it all by yourselves. You know, you're just one of a variety of youth activities or movements or whatever. Rubbish.
And if I can just add one more thing, I agree with you, Stefan, about the Catholic world, which is a fairly rich world. $1 million
salaries for the VC of Australian Catholic University. Scandal.
Schools and hospitals and so on, to the detriment of the real poor in this country.
Yeah. All right. I think Kevin was next with a question, and then there's Mark. I see Mark's hand is up too. Kevin?
Yep, thanks, Stefan. Thanks, Bill. Following on from your question, your point about the empowering of lay people. Yeah, and one of the last slides you had, you talked about painting the YCW as a religious thing. And I haven't got it right, but I feel that the lay people have got to take some direct action in relation to making the gospel and making the way of Jesus a more human endeavor or project, whatever. The church organization is, as Bill has clearly pointed out, aligned itself in a particular way. But, and the experience, I think, with the plenary council and the synod and synodality is that expressions of frustrations by lay people, generally who make up the majority of population, of Catholic population, are ignored and glossed over and watered down. My question is, how do we reverse that? How do lay people, ordinary lay people, take on this job of building the school or whatever? Or where are the opportunities? Where are the openings?
Yeah, well, that's a big question. Maybe others have got some answers. I mean, the small thing we've tried to do as ACI, well, we've tried to sort of defend and, you know, like make known Cardijn's ideas. So that's kind of the level of which we're operating. But I think there's much more to be done, and I know you're doing a lot with the Coalition on Catholic Reform, Australian Catholic Coalition. Yeah. Anyway, I think many people here are familiar with it, so that's another initiative. But yeah, I think there's got to be initiatives, and maybe, you know, I don't know, maybe at some point we've got to kind of find a way of coming together. Yeah, I really do feel I totally agree with you. It's time that, you know, lay people. As Cardijn said also, it's time for us to put up our hands and, well, grasp, you know, just get out there and do it. Yeah, but I mean, it's hard, you know. Well, I mean, Zoom is the great opportunity we've got, I suppose, because it doesn't cost much to reach people. So I suppose that's the potential means, but definitely think we've got to do it. Anybody else want to comment on that? Yeah. And then I see Mark's got his hand up as well. Do you want to go straight away, Mark?
Okay. Yeah, so basically, I just wanted to tell you something. The other night at my place, I had a few blokes around, and we had a chat about women. So we started off with Joseph Cardijn's mother, and we had a look at what Joseph Cardijn's mother, how she ran the family, and she had a very big teaching influence on Joseph Cardijn. And you can see, even when the family was deciding that, you know, they would be all right with Joseph Cardijn being a priest, you know, the father and the mother, they look at each other as partners, you know, and they give the nod kind of thing that, yeah, they'll do this, even though it would be really hard. So then we started looking at women in our lives, you know, influential women that we've known and all this kind of stuff. We did a bit of a judge, using Gospels and that. And we don't need any priests to do this. You know, we're supposed to be able to do this ourselves. It's not rocket science. And so we decided to, you know, to try to take action in our lives, what we were called to do. We accept that we are ordinary, you know, people. We've got a mission to bring God's kingdom, and that's what we're supposed to do. You know, I don't see that we need to kind of wait for some huge, great spiritual blessing from anybody. You know, this is you know, something that comes straight from God, and it can't wait for, you know, anybody, you know, really clever people to understand what's actually extremely simple. And I suspect sometimes it's because of its simplicity, the whole idea of the lay apostolate, that really clever people just can't get it because it's so simple. But it's designed for ordinary people to take action in their lives. And I think we should just kind of get on with it.
Well, yes. I mean, what can I say? You're trying with your group. I'm trying with my kind of research. Yeah, but you know, we kind of haven't reached critical mass, have we? I mean, we've got to kind of accept that, and we've got to figure out how we sort of kind of go to the next level somehow. I feel, you know, but I don't have the answer.
What I'm saying, Stefan, is that we should just do it ourselves. That's basically what I'm saying.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, we can say that, and we should do it ourselves. But I do think otherwise, what is the point of the church? If the church is not supporting us, what is it doing? You know, it's trying to build an alternative with church services and I can tell you one thing, as you talk about Cardijn when he was a kid and a boy, we know the other famous story of Cardijn as a boy, when he left school to go into this minor seminary, and he comes back after a year and all these kids have, all these schoolmates who went to work in the factories, they've lost their faith in the space of 1 year. Well, I see that happening today. There's my daughter who left high school, a 4,000, it's not even expensive for a Catholic education, but I sent her to a Catholic high school, $4,000 a year and all that kind of thing. Once she leaves school, there's no support. Suddenly there's all this support. And I remember one thing that really struck me while she was in her final year of high school. Papa, everybody hates the church. That's what she told me, Everybody hates the church. Now, I mean, one thing is kind of the abuse kind of thing. That's definitely a thing, but that's not the only thing. The point is the things that the church is putting its money into is not working, and somehow that's got to change. And I mean, yeah, we can say that lay people have got to do it, but what about the YCW in Perth, where I come from, just struggling? A few young people, and they're doing great work as such. But how do we help them to make a bigger movement, to make a movement that reaches the mass of young workers, as Cardijn said? Yeah, I think that we need to work ourselves, but we need to get some support from the church. We need to work for the church to support what we're doing. Yep. Well, that's my thoughts and Mark's thoughts. Nora again. Yep, go for it.
Well, I do see the problem also being that priests tend to be bound to parishes. You get religious orders, all right, that are not bound as such to a parish, as a parish priest, but they also need support. They also need financial support. So it's almost as if the structure of the church, a parish church, is such that it brings in the money, so it's part of the economy of the church, that it's dependent on people going to church and just putting their money in the collection, which was exposed, by the way, during COVID, when there was lockdown and people could not go to church. So that was the time when laity should have really come to the fore, and if we could have, and said, well, how far do we actually need parish churches? If the church can have religious organizations like Dominicans, Franciscans, and so on, why can't the laity have our own religious movement, a movement of lay people, and organize ourselves, basically, so that we're not, but it's not that easy to do that, I should say. Here I am dreaming a dream here, because of the way the economy of the church is structured. And it's almost structured like the aristocracy. If you look at Britain, for example, and the pomp and the ceremony and the way that is tied to churches, and then it draws that the people who want celebrities and Kardashian type figures to look up to, that are not so much human beings anymore. They're representing social class, aspirations, and all sorts of other things. And one of the problems, I think, is also, and why I think the Latin American church took the option for the poor, is that, and why Pope Francis, for example, refuses to drive in a fancy car and insists on wearing ordinary shoes and things like that, is to try and break that. But it's not so easy to break that. And there might be priests coming from very poor families, by the way, who have an aspiration to a certain lifestyle that certain churches in elite areas can give them. So, a strong lay movement can also help with the formation of priests. Yeah, so I've got all sorts of disparate ideas there that I've sort of thrown into the pot. Thanks.
Thanks, Nora. Yeah, great. Well, yeah. Well, there is a lot of ideas in the pot there, and a lot of them coming down to, well, we've got to find a way to take some steps ourselves as lay people. So I'm not sure if we can get an action out of today's event, but I'd be very pleased. Personally, I'd be very happy to work with anybody to take any of these ideas forward. Maybe it's a bit hard to kind of find the right way right now, but David's put in the chat, yes, we've got the Cardijn Community Australia, which is working towards that. Australian Cardijn Institute, we're also trying. So yeah, we're also trying to start a kind of foundation to support this work as well. Yeah, so there are things we're trying to do. We're very much at the starting point of them. Yeah, we're really happy to have your assistance, commitment, finance, everything you can offer to such an event. Of course, not saying we're the only ones, but we're also, I think, at least me, we're happy to work with others on this initiative as well. Yeah. Are there any more questions? Somebody else got a question? David's got a question. Yep.
I was interested in what Peter Marr was saying about the new evangelization, and I think the whole Bishops Fisher and Porteous and Comensoli, they've taken on the divine renovation and alpha approach, which is good, but it starts with the revelation end of the sacred secular continuum. It doesn't acknowledge that Pope Francis, while he talks about missionary disciples, he's also talking, about the personal relationship with Jesus and the role of the Holy Spirit. He insists on those things, but he also insists on life, the environment, fratelli tutti, about our relationships, the development of virtues, all as an integral thing. And the new evangelization is very, as it's interpreted by those bishops, is very selective. And I noticed it just contrasts with one of your slides, Stefan, where Cardijn's talking about the transformation by, with, and in Christ in the church through sacraments, but which is incarnated in the affairs of the world, the institutions of the world. It's just, he's holding the church and the spiritual and the world together at the same time. And that, what you call the Christian dialectic, what he called, I think, the YCW dialectic, that integration is against the dualism. So in the end, it's a theological problem, I think, that that they don't, it's basically dualism, and it's just been around it's hamstrung the church for the 20th century, and it's been around from the beginning. But there's plenty of evidence in the Gospels and in the saints and in the whole tradition, the whole apostolic tradition of the church, which used to be called the active apostolate and the contemplative apostolate, ora et labora, together, holding them together. We're just turning our back on it and just adopting these basically Protestant-style evangelization of Alpha in the UK and divine renovation in the United States. And basically it's well, it's not a heresy, because you can start anywhere start with Revelation, that's great. You can start anywhere on that spectrum of life and God. And Cardijn found that most people started with life. And I would agree with him. We all learn about love from the cradle, not from the gospel.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's like what I think about Catholic schools. I think Catholic schools work very well for Catholics. People that have already got a Catholic faith, it sort of adds to it. What about those that don't have it? And I think this is the thing, Cardijn was always reaching out to the young workers who kind of nicked off from the church as soon as they left school. That's always was his focus. And, another one of his famous phrases was, he used to say it so many times, obviously you start thinking, well, why does he keep repeating this? He says, when I met people in the parish, I didn't ask them whether they came to mass. Nearly every country he went to visit, he tells his audience. When I met the young workers outside the factory, I didn't ask them whether they came to mass on Sunday. I asked them if they earned enough money to support their families. That's what he said. And it's, as Mark said, it's very simple, but somehow we complicate things. And but there is a theological issue and a kind of philosophical issue, this dualism thing. And it's also what we see as religious. We see as religious this very narrow concept of religious. Yeah. Well, I don't know. What do we do next? We've kind of reached an hour and a half of our time here, so we probably better take a break. But has anybody else got any last comments or thoughts that they'd like to share or questions?
Sounds like we might be at the end, Stefan.
That's great. Yep.
Yep.
Fair enough. Yeah.
That's been a great event. Say on behalf of all those who have listened to you, Stefan, that what has come through loud and clear tonight is your commitment to Cardijn and all that he stood for. Your depth of knowledge is extraordinary, and your commitment to the lay apostolate is equally so. I think one of the problems that we've had, the development of the Joseph's contribution in Australia, I speak for Australia, is that we haven't had a strong intellectual contribution to the debate within the church about formation and the role of the laity. I think we've all let the team down, so to speak, in the post-Vatican years. Sorry, I qualify that. There have been a few voices who have stood out against that void or vacuum, and you're one of them, Stefan. You've been not just a pioneer in learning about the Cardijn tradition and what Cardijn has done, but you've been a prominent proponent of history, and if only there were more of you over that period of time, I think we would be in a different position. I think it's terribly important that Josephs promote in an intellectual way based on good research and a good understanding of the current world in which we live, a vision of how formation might take place. And I think what you did tonight has been very helpful in that regard. Another contribution from you, Stefan. So on behalf of all of those who have participated, thanks very much, Stefan, for what you've done tonight. I think we might just finish the meeting formally at this stage. We'll stay on for a few minutes for anyone who wants to chat a little bit. But could I just finish with the YCS prayer? Lord Jesus, fill us with your spirit of love. Help us to see the world as you do, to judge with your heart, to act with the strength and courage you have shown us as we work to transform our world. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, Brian. Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, just say, perhaps you'd say a few words as we're sort of winding down. Yeah,
well, anyway, look, thanks to everybody for joining. As you can tell, I've got a bit of passion about the whole subject from life experience, but also from the intellectual aspect, seeing the way, Cardijn had to fight. Boy, like I must admit, like when I was in the YCW, you think you hear, oh, Cardijn was a cardinal, and you think he's this big, great authoritative figure that everybody listens to. But when you actually study his life, every stage of his life, everything he fought for was a battle. It's just that kind of staggers me, really. It staggers me also that kind of the way he kept going. I actually, I don't know, what do you call it? Heroic virtues. If you're going to canonize somebody for having heroic virtues, I reckon the way he stuck at it, what's that virtue called? That's one of the virtues that was heroic on Cardijn's.
Resilience.
Resilience. Yeah, that's the modern name for it. Resilience.
Perseverance.
Perseverance. Is that the theological or whatever virtue it is?
No, that's what Cardijn told us to do, Stefan. Cardijn told us to persevere.
Yeah, well, he did right till his end, and then he told us to keep persevering. So yeah, let's do it. Yeah.